Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Josh Cohen to discuss how to live, what to do, in search of ourselves in life and literature, published by our friends at Pantheon Books. And here's Josh. I think Josh has been trying to get on the platform. Have you managed?
I have.
Okay, we are live. We are live, but we can't quite see you yet. So
Yeah.
I
Okay.
just want to continue the introduction.
Yes.
What's happening?
There
There you are.
Can you?
There you are.
There
Yeah,
I am.
here you
Yes.
are. Okay, so let me
Had to
tell
move
folks.
rooms.
Let me tell folks about you. You're a psychoanalyst in private practice and a professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. Josh is the author of books and articles on modern literature, cultural theory, and psychoanalysis, including How to Read Freud, The Private Life, Our Everyday Self in an Age of Intrusion, and Not Working, Why We Have to Stop. He lives in London, from where he joins us today. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Nuar Alsadir, a writer and psychoanalyst. She's the author of the forthcoming nonfiction book, Animal Joy, as well as the poetry collections Fourth Person Singular, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry and the Forward Prize for Best Collection, and More Shadow Than Bird. She lives in New York City. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of How to Live, What to Do from Books and Books below. We truly appreciate every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to our guests. Nuar, are you coming back out? Let me bring you back out. Here we go. Hello, welcome.
Thank you. I think I'm muted. Am I muted?
I don't think so. No, I can hear you.
Josh, do you want to start us off by reading?
I do. I've had to move rooms, so I was bringing in props and lighting, so I'm just going to go and get my books. Bear with me.
Meanwhile, maybe we can take a look at this beautiful cover. Isn't that beautiful? This is the gallery. You know, Pantheon does such a great job with their books. I'm so excited about everything that's going on at Pantheon, too.
I have the British version.
Oh, let me see. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I love that.
Good. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And I am going to read a passage from the book, the chapter on marriage. You probably know that the book is made up of chapters, each one of which covers a different stage of life. And so marriage is chapter 6. And each chapter explores the dilemmas and the experience of a particular stage of life through 3 fictional characters. And here I'm about to start talking about a character in D.H. Lawrence, a man named Will Brangwen, who lives, of course, in rural Nottinghamshire. But Lawrence is always talking about marriage and the conflicts of sexuality and ordinary life, and the strangeness really of what it means to be in a couple. Lawrence sees coupledom as both the most natural and driven, impulsive state of human being, and at the same time, the maddest and the most unsettling. The idea of living in proximity to another person, which is the most ordinary thing in the world, and Lawrence is clear that it is very ordinary, is also something that estranges us from ourselves and that we never quite get used to, really. We never quite understand why it is we are embarking on this strange experiment. So I'm going to start, here. A craving for intimacy afflicts us from the minute we enter the world. Ejected from the womb, we seek the same enveloping protection in tight proximity to our mother's skin. But as we grow older, we are pulled between a desire to escape the constrictions of this closeness and a desire to recreate it. Most of us become familiar at some point with the predicament that results. The absence of intimacy induces feelings of emptiness and depletion, while a surfeit of intimacy can make us feel suffocated. Few writers have explored this paradox of intimacy more fully or boldly than D.H. Lawrence. In his fiction, essays, and poetry, Lawrence developed a kind of metaphysics of love and sex, at the heart of which is the idea that intimate love begets a sense not of reassuring familiarity, but of radical and disturbing strangeness. Like many keen readers, I first read Lawrence in late adolescence. The appeal is obvious. No one captures more forcefully the turbulent landscape of the emotions as we experienced them at that time of life. And yet I now realize that I was far too young for Lawrence at that age. He unsettled me so much. I could respond to him only with defensive flippancy. Every casual touch, every word, every glance between a man and a woman, and between men, and between women, and between adults and children, and between humans and animals, seemed so heavily freighted with signs and wonders. Did bones really have to melt, hearts and guts to tear every time a boy kissed a girl, or even looked at one? Come on, Dave, lighten up. Sometimes a snog is just a snog. Recalling running commentaries like this at least reassures me I wasn't nearly as precocious as I sometimes remember myself being. It turns out that it takes some experience of intimate life to understand what Lawrence is talking about. Loving someone over the long term, most obviously a lover, but equally a child or a friend, cultivates a region of subterranean contact between the individuals involved that they might be only fitfully aware of. So much discussion about relationships these days seems to be based around observations of the over-familiarity they breed. The same jokes, the same stories, the same arguments, the same excuses, the same gross habits, and then, after a glass of wine or two, the same old body, the same moves in bed, the same lack of imagination. No doubt there is some truth to this story, or it wouldn't be told so often by so many. But isn't there also something defensive about it? Perhaps we're closer to Lawrence's intuitions about relationships than is comfortable for us to acknowledge. Might we not prefer to laugh at the predictability of the person we love because the alternative would be to touch on the very different and frightening reality of our intimacy? Lawrence's point is that as our knowledge of a lover deepens, so does their essential mystery. Quote, he knew she was his woman, he writes of Tom Brangwen and his wife Lydia in The Rainbow from 1915. Quote, he knew her essence, that it was his to possess, and he seemed to live thus in contact with her, in contact with the unknown, the unaccountable, and the incalculable. The unknown, the unaccountable, and incalculable. may be much more important elements of a lasting relationship than we realize. But what exactly does this mean for the everyday conduct of a marriage? So I'm going to leave that there. That's really, I think, Lawrence's rather startling contribution to our ideas about marriage, that the whole tendency to a feeling of overfamiliarity that marriage can bring is actually a kind of layer of defense that we place over something more disturbing than familiarity, which is strangeness. That we pretend we know the other so well, partly because we fear that we don't really know them. There's something about them that remains always unknowable to us.
What you call estrangement reminds me of what the Russian formalists call defamiliarization. And the idea in that is by making the familiar strange, you bring it back to life, because there's a kind of waking sleep or invisibility that people and things that are familiar take on. And by defamiliarizing or estranging those familiar people or things, you see them again.
Right. And that is particularly important, I think, when it comes to ordinary life, to the texture of everyday being and human interaction. There are certain kinds of elements of our lives that we become dismissive or contemptuous about. Lawrence really is always giving the example of marital bickering. Bickering is something that we tend to think makes us look small, petty. It shows us the worst of ourselves. It shows us sort of focusing with relentless negativity on everything that irritates and frustrates us and that we can't cope with. And sometimes when we see ourselves bickering, we're quite unforgiving about ourselves. We feel that it just embarrasses us. Lawrence says there is something really interesting going on in bickering, something that we shouldn't be so ready to be contemptuous about. And that's the defamiliarizing. That's the, what you talk about, the Russian formalist effect of removing that patina of knownness on everyday things and suddenly seeing things in a new light. Lawrence can take an ordinary marital row and make it something life or death. Make it something where something profound, metaphysically charged is going on. One soul is trying to speak to another and failing. And he does this. What I love about it is he doesn't do this by simply translating it into highfalutin language. He has the couple row about doing the cleaning, about getting in the way when she's trying to clean the carpet or whatever. It's a very sort of familiar pattern to anybody who's really experienced any relationship of any kind, but certainly a long-term living relationship. And yet it shows us how much is at stake in a moment like that, how much is going on, and how interesting and rich and disturbing it is.
So do you think bickering expresses a kind of struggle to be seen?
I think so. I think that there is so much yearning and so much desperation in bickering. It becomes a kind of automatic pattern. And so we are no longer aware of what we're doing when we're bickering. We think that we are on autopilot. We get bored of ourselves, saying the same things, complaining about, the same tendencies in the partner. You're so lazy, you're so naggy, etc. And so we lose any contact with the deeper layer of communication that's going on in bickering, which is exactly that, I think, to say, yeah, but there's something deeper in me, some level of need, of desire, of appeal that not only are you not able to hear, but I'm not able to get it across to you. All I can do is keep repeating myself and keep, in a way, putting up a screen exactly where I want to remove it, because when we say the same old things, we distance ourselves from the other person at the very moment we're trying to get them to get closer to us.
It's interesting that you say that bickering is boring, because in my clinical practice, I often see boredom as a defense against some of those huge or overwhelming emotions. And usually when boredom creeps up, there's something that has to be kept at bay. And the boredom makes it puts it into a compartment that can't be seen or accessed. So it becomes invisible.
Yeah. I think boredom is completely fascinating in a clinical context for what it tells you about, boredom outside the consulting room. But I often find that I can be sort of shunted into boredom at moments when I feel a little fearful or trepidatious about what might be going on between us, or when I don't know what's going on, when I feel that there is something being communicated to me by the person in my consulting room that is disturbing, that is half understood, that is maybe kind of an outlaw feeling, which might be sexual, it might be hatred, it might be a kind of desperate need being expressed towards me, and also towards someone else, somebody who's not in the room. All of that intensity of feeling, I think, we can shunt it to the side and take refuge in boredom. And I think we probably do that a lot in everyday relationships as well.
That gives me a good way of segueing to your use of clinical material in the book, which was one of the many things I loved about it. It's such a difficult thing to do, to write about clinical material and make it specific enough so that it is alive and it feels real, and also respect the privacy of the person whose story it is. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach it or how you think about it? And maybe also how it relates to writing about literary characters, because you tend to treat the analytic characters and the literary characters similarly.
Yeah, and that point is, I think, particularly important. The book begins, of course, with a kind of author's note, which is about this conflict that anyone who wants to write, any psychotherapist who wants to write about clinical material, has to face, which is that you want to be true to the material, or else why bother putting it out there at all? And at the same time, you have to respect confidentiality. And in a way, it's an impossible impasse. And it's tempting for a lot of us just not to write clinically at all. It's actually more of a problem, I think, when you're writing for a specialist collegial audience readership, because then really you want to be entirely accurate about what happened in the consulting room. And these days, of course, anything you write is accessible to pretty much anyone else. And so it's very difficult to write about clinical material in a professional context, because it will be discovered, and it will be discovered in a much more raw form, I think, if you want to get the material right. In a book like this, which is really written for general readership, for anybody who's interested, I don't think you have the same obligation to write with absolute accuracy. That is sort of factual correctness, because I think there's something more important than factual correctness, which is something like the atmosphere and the spirit and the meaning of the psychotherapy encounter. And what I was trying to do, I composite cases. I bring together, usually sort of concertina, a number of different cases in one case. The point is, of course, so that nobody would be able to read this and recognize themselves or say, hey, that's me. Even the habits of speech, which I try to give to analytic characters to make sure that they seem distinctive and real, I actually sort of splice together different habits of speech from different patients, so that when they appear on the page, they should hopefully be as differentiated from the people who inspired the cases as possible. And the stories, of course, the same thing. The characterological tics, everything really is spliced together. So there is really a lot of imaginative effort involved, I think, in protecting the confidentiality of your patients and at the same time writing about them something like truthfully. The way I would justify it, and this gets to your next point, which is the way that the literary and the analytic characters can seem interchangeable. Freud, of course, famously says right at the beginning of sort of his development of psychotherapy, in his first book of psychotherapy cases, he says it will come as a surprise to some readers that these clinical cases should read like short stories. And he explains that the reason for this is that he has to infuse the writing of the cases with their human charge, with the sense of drama and force. Because if he doesn't do that, all he's doing really is presenting a cluster of symptoms, a cluster of sort of psychiatrically observed facts, and that, he says, betrays the nature of the clinical encounter. The clinical encounter is a human encounter, and human encounters involve narrative, involve storytelling. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to say we make this distinction between real life relationships and fictional or imaginary relationships. But in fact, we're always imagining people that we know. We're always imagining our real life relationships, even and especially the people that we're closest to, our parents, our partners, our siblings, our best friends, our colleagues. They are all filtered through imagination, through fantasy, through all kinds of filters, distortions, embellishments, heightenings. No one really comes to us baldly as they are. Now, in fictional characters, on the other hand, in a way, it goes back the other way. We say, well, fictional characters just exist on the page, but of course they don't. They exist in the space of our heads, and we do things with fictional characters. I'm just going to have to interrupt myself because my dog is scratching at the door. So I'm going to just let her in, and hopefully she won't disturb us too much. There she is. Okay.
If it makes you feel any better, I just had someone walk in and make a sandwich.
Oh, very good. Okay. Well, I hope it's a good sandwich.
I was muted.
Yeah. I was not able to control the encounter with the dog. You know, we're always trying to sort of regulate our encounters in the consulting room, but dogs are exempt from regulation. What is it? Never work with children or animals.
Does your dog sit in the room with you when you see patients over Zoom?
Well, over Zoom, yeah. most of the time she does. I mean, she just lies on a rug, and I would say 99 out of 100 times no one is aware that she's there. She almost never kind of wanders into shot. But when she has, I think people like it. They feel it's very humanizing, and there is a kind of, it's interesting. People talk about a level of trust that infuses them when they see that a person has a dog. It makes them look real and like they have investments in the world. So I feel okay about that. But I was just to go back to the point about literary characters. So literary characters exist in the space of our heads, and we often have a very sort of personal relationship to them. Not just, of course, characters from novels, but characters from movies, and people who exist in a kind of liminal space between the fictional and the real. People like rock stars, thinking about someone like David Bowie. He sort of insinuated himself into the consciousness of the time, and was felt to be known by so many people because he was both real and an imaginative creation. And it seems to me, again, he's tapping into something that we do in all our relationships.
To jump in, do you think we might all be real and a product of our imaginations?
I really believe that. I really believe that is both intuitively the right way to think about it, the way we all experience it. And I also think it's the most psychologically and philosophically rigorous way to think about it as well. I think, modern philosophy really starts from the premise that you can never know anyone or anything else absolutely, immediately, baldly up front, that there's always something that interposes between you and something else.
Yeah, and what you were talking about earlier, about people's imaginary versions, I call them psychic representations of people, is sometimes comforting in sessions. If somebody's talking about a loved person and they feel guilty, I sometimes remind them that I'm not listening to what they're saying and hearing information about the real person in the world, but I'm listening and hearing information about the psychic representation of that person and what that means for the patient and their psyche. And it's not really about that person at all in the session.
Yes. And I often think that for the same reason, people often turn to cultural experiences. They tell you about a movie that they've seen. They tell you about a novel that they love. They tell you about their relationship with characters or places in an imaginary universe, that is a way of telling you, well, yeah, they are a psychic representation. And I know that a lot of the characters that I chose to write about in this book, I chose them because they must be, each one of them, representing some sort of fundamental psychic internal experience that I've had.
Yeah, so in a sense, we're learning about you through your discussion of the characters, because your psychic representation of them is part of what you're writing. It's your own creation,
exactly,
even as it's an author's creation.
Yes, and so I often feel like you can sort of do memoir and you can do autobiography through a kind of criticism, that if you're aware that that's what you're doing, then you can read novels and talk about what's going on in the page and how a character is constructed or how an irony is constructed. But if what you're also talking about is what this character, what this story makes happen to you inside, then you're also telling a story about yourself.
In fact, I often, with people who are having trouble accessing a deeper level of their psyche, I mean, the unconscious can't be accessed directly. So, that's why we look for dreams or intrusive thoughts. One of the things I ask people to look for is if they're watching a movie or reading a book and they get a really powerful feeling, whether it's anxiety or repulsion, or they have to leave the room, or they cry, that is often indicative of some kind of resonance with their unconscious. And so it can also be a way of reading or watching yourself, to read or watch a film. And literary characters, I think it's even more the case with, because you create them in your head as you're reading, whereas in a film, someone's staged it for you.
Yeah, that's right. That's why people so often complain about adaptations. They say, whatever it might be, DiCaprio, that's not Gatsby, and I think there is something jarring and disturbing about having somebody else's imagining of a character intrude into yours. And so sometimes when we say that about adaptations, often what we're talking about is a kind of benign narcissism. We want to believe this book and my relationship to this book belongs to me. And it's been wrenched out of the circuit of myself, the circuit of my own head, and it's been put somewhere else on screen where I don't recognize it. This is a Gatsby, but it's not my Gatsby. And in a way, the only Gatsby that you could bear to see externalized, sort of taken off the page, is one that was magically projected from your own head onto a screen.
And that's amplified even more if you think about what it feels like when somebody gives you a representation, their representation of you, and it doesn't match up with your representation in your mind of yourself.
Yes, that's right. And I always think that the people that we see know so much about us. And it's not that they know so much about us in spite of the fact that we disclose very little, right? We, as psychotherapists, of course, we don't talk about our personal lives. We don't share too much information. They will, of course, these days Google us, but hopefully they will not find out anything that is too private or intimate that way. They'll just find out who we are, in the public domain. But I often find that when you hear an insight about yourself or an observation about yourself from a patient, it is unsettlingly accurate, and it seems to get at something that you feel, well, they couldn't possibly have known that about me. And for me, it's sort of the great affirmation that, we actually do speak one unconscious to another, that we do say so much more about ourselves in real encounters than we understand ourselves to be doing. But it's also just fascinating because you like to imagine that you regulate and determine and master the ways in which you're seen and understood and perceived. And it's both a shock, but also sometimes a really refreshing surprise to be made to see yourself in another way. And I think that happens a lot. We talk about that, of course, in relation to patients or clients, that they get to see themselves in another way. But it's also true of us as psychotherapists, that we are made to sort of see these really surprising and unsettling reflections of ourselves in the words and the responses of these others that we're privileged to speak to.
It's also very liberating to be able to change and not to think of oneself as one unified singular self, but a constantly evolving system of
Yeah,
characteristics.
yeah,
Which also brings me to the issue of change. You talk about it a lot in the book, and you connect it with the imagination and the importance of the imagination in change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, sure.
How we can use our imagination as a laboratory for change?
Yeah, yeah, that's a lovely word. Um, it begins really with the discussion of Alice, um, the first character that is talked about um, is Alice of Wonderland, um, and Alice is a character that appeals to me, but I think is also a kind of foundation for everything that then goes on to happen in the book, because she is intensely playful. Um, she wanders down the rabbit hole of her own dream life, of her own unconscious, and she wanders through the landscape of her imagination. And instead of being terrified by it and shutting her eyes, and if you like, waking herself up out of her dream, she wanders through it really freely and boldly, speaking to everyone who appears out of her unconscious, talking eggs, smoking caterpillars, whoever, sort of mildly psychopathic um, uh, kings and queens. And she embraces all of this teeming strangeness of her dream landscape, of her imaginative landscape, in a way that is so generous and so unfazed. She's not someone who's saying, hang on, what's going on here? She never seems to ask that question. She seems to take on trust that whatever's happening, however weird and disturbing it looks, well, it's got its own logic, it's got its own momentum. And that kind of generosity, that expansiveness of vision, of perception, of imagination, I think it has so much to teach us. And what I'm trying to say is that there is something about the atmosphere in which this girl lives, the care that she receives, the way in which she's obviously encouraged to live a playful, imaginative life of her own. There's that passage where she talks about her kitten playing chess, and she lives in a world in which no one's going to argue with her that her kitten plays chess or say, "Hey, hang on, cats can't play chess." So the thinker that I'm kind of most engaged with at this point is the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, who has this idea that in play you enter a region that is somewhere between, and this is what we've been talking about all along, I guess, Nuar, but a region between the real and the imaginary, and that there's an intermediate space that we all have to occupy in our early lives. We have to occupy a space, that is, where there's a kind of ambiguity about what's real and what's imaginary. So you don't say cats don't play chess. You don't say, oh yes, cats do play chess. You keep the ambiguity alive, that the little girl both knows that cats don't play chess, and she doesn't know it at all, because the world in which they can play chess is so alive and so real for her. And what Winnicott says is that, of course, we grow out of this, and we generally sort of make peace with moving to the side of reality, with, if you like, the contest between imagination and reality is settled in favor of reality. But that intermediate space between the two, between imagination and reality, diffuses, he says, into our cultural lives. into novels, into movies, into all the ways in which we continue to be in this imaginary space. We watch a movie, we don't say, oh, well, that can't happen. I mean, hopefully we don't. Or read a novel and say, well, that's brilliant. I mean, implausibility is an interesting issue. But the point is that implausibility on its own is not a deal breaker in our pleasure or even in our sense that something is nonetheless real. Something can be physically impossible. It can defy all kinds of laws of waking life. And yet we feel that it is true and real for us. And that, I think, comes from that experience of early life where the imagination has been allowed some free play. And if we don't have that, if we're not allowed to kind of wander in our illusions the way Alice does, then all kinds of pathologies result. We become rigid. We become fearful. We become imaginatively closed off. And so all kinds of questions about what we can do, what we can enjoy, who we can love, the kinds of places that are interesting or not to us, all these decisions that we make, they can be very constricted and they can be very sort of narrow if we don't have the imaginative life that allows us to think, to sort of move, expand in different directions.
So you're not just talking about play, you're talking about free play, and play with rules may have a different effect. And I'm thinking here also about social media and what you think of the presence of it in the lives of children, while whether play is influenced by it or restricted, or whether there's an increase of imagining oneself from the outside that restricts play.
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I feel like a little wary of trying to give too tidy an answer because, of course, the internet and social media are really a world unto themselves, and they have as much texture and complexity as the real world. And so generalizing about them is kind of a bit of a treacherous enterprise. But I do think that certainly the channels of social media for young people tend to be mobilized in such a way that for a lot of them, it closes down their sense of themselves, their self-image. So, for example, there are a lot of people, young people, who social media pressures into feeling they have to look a certain way or talk a certain way or be interested or excited about something and not interested or excited about something else. And of course, that can be enforced in so many different ways, just by what's idealized and liked as an image or as a statement, or by the kinds of peer pressure that are so effectively kind of enforced through social media. I'm also aware that something else happens on social media, which is that people living in very constricted and oppressive real life communities suddenly find their imaginative possibilities expanded. Young people, for example, who feel like they are not the gender that they are born into, or they're not the sexuality that is being legislated for them by the culture around them, find massive solace and people to talk to through social media. I really don't want to understate the importance of that, or to suggest that it all goes in one direction. But I think what it does do is even when it's positive, I think it closes down that private space in which we're able to cultivate ourselves in conversation with ourselves. That sort of teenage bedroom thing where instead of retreating into the teenage bedroom as a sealed off space where you can be with yourself and sort of fearlessly, you can look at yourself and delve into your own consciousness without fear of being judged because you're the only person there. And I think the teenage bedroom now is something very different. I think it's kind of hedged in on all sides by these various imaginary and real actors who are sort of wanting to look into it, who are peering into the bedroom, and they may be encouraging voices, they may be judging voices, they may be bullying voices, they may be supportive voices, but whatever kind of voices they are, they're intruding into private space, and that I think is just a change that we have to learn to live with and adapt to, and I guess push towards as much imaginative expansion as possible.
I just noticed that some questions have come through. Is it okay if I read one of them to you?
Please, yeah.
Josh, can you tell us a little about your reading life and how you determined which books or stories you used as examples?
Yeah, thanks. Well, my reading life is very omnivorous. I sometimes think that, one key sort of virtue or quality of a literature professor is something I don't really have, which is a kind of a fine discrimination that says, I like this, therefore I don't like that. I'm always surprised that there's very little. I'm not very good at dismissing or saying, that there's a whole class of books that I don't like. So it meant that I was dealing with a kind of intimidatingly large field of books, and rather than sort of go through my library and think, okay, well, childhood could be this, could be that. I've obviously read many books about childhood, many books about marriage, of course, many books about ambition. And so I try to do what I do in the psychotherapy room, what I've been trained to do in psychotherapy, which is instead of being active and opening books and looking at them, right, we don't open and look at the books of our patients. We instead sit and listen for what comes to us. And that's, when I thought about childhood, what I did first of all was think, what comes to me? Which are the characters who have felt to me, who have really made something happen in me, who bring childhood alive in a way that feels meaningful and sort of bring out the stakes of what childhood is. And that's how Alice came to me. That was the first character that I knew had to be written about. Others came in a more roundabout detour way, but usually they came to me like that kind of moment. I know who I need to write about here. Almost all of them came like that. And once I had a character who made sense to me, once I had, say, Johnny Grimes as an adolescent rebel, Johnny Grimes from James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, I didn't really argue with that selection. I didn't say, well, maybe so-and-so would be better. I sort of had faith that my unconscious had sort of brought the right character to me. And so my reading life was sort of, in a way, is and was, for the purposes of this book, a kind of an outgrowth of my unconscious life more generally.
So your choices reveal aspects of your interior.
Yeah. And I the marriage, and sometimes this is very surprising. So the marriage selections are pretty dark in a way, right? I'm not going to start disclosing what my own marriage is like, but I was interested because, of course, it doesn't matter how rich or sort of, well, let's use the word happy your marriage is. You cannot be in a relationship like marriage and not know how difficult and difficult in the sense that Lawrence was talking about in that passage, right? Difficult in the sense that being alongside someone else, sharing the same spaces as them, being in what Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch says there is something awful about the newness marriage brings. And I think you can understand that awful in two ways, right? Awful in the idiomatic sense of just not very nice, but awful also in the sense that in a sense that is close to awesome.
Or awe.
Just awe, yeah, full of awe. There is something extraordinary about the existence of this other person alongside yourself.
I think it's interesting that when you said you didn't want to disclose about your own marriage, it reminded me of what you were saying earlier, because often if someone knows the facts about your life, they don't know you intimately, but a patient in session can know you so intimately without knowing any facts about your life, because they know the way that your mind moves. They would know, they can anticipate your reactions or your responses. And that's a kind of intimacy that often you have with a child too, a pre-linguistic child.
Right.
They can know you so well without even understanding what you're talking about when you're speaking.
Yeah, I love that. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And there is a kind of affinity between those two relationships. Not, of course, that we experience the people we see necessarily as children, although that is an aspect of the relationship. But
well, I mean, children in the best sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's when we're in an intimate relationship with a child that we are aware of how much of relating goes on off stage in a space that has nothing to do with facts or words.
I'm going to read another question. Nuar and Josh, I'm thinking of what you discussed about children who haven't experienced free play and the possibility of resulting pathologies. Do you feel literature in later life and creativity in later life can be redemptive? I'm asking, I suppose, what can be done for such children later in life? Psychoanalysis.
Yes. I feel like this is addressed to both of us, and I'm going to ask you because I know you'll have interesting things to say about this.
Well, Winnicott, one of his ideas was that the analytic space and relationship is a place for precisely those people who weren't allowed the space to figure out who they were by experimenting through play with different aspects and impulses of themselves. And so having those kinds of people, giving them this room and the space to do that in the analysis is their opportunity to have it later in life and figure out who they are. And part of that is he had this idea of the holding environment where he would accept any emotion that came into the room. And so he allowed people to express themselves freely, even when it was uncomfortable. And that's a big issue in analysis, what you do with aggression or rage when it comes up, whether you give someone space to express it or whether you try to stop it or you reject it or you retaliate. And Winnicott thinks a lot about that as well, how damaging retaliation can be.
Yeah. I think that I think that is something that happens in psychotherapy sometimes. Retaliation, because of course it is very hard to receive a lot of very hostile projections and everyone's human, and sometimes people will say something sarcastic or mean back. And I have in a previous book I wrote called Not Working, I actually have an example of that, where I was under siege really from this guy who would just subject me to this merciless anatomizing every single day, not just insults, but kind of fine-tuned analysis of just how useless I was. And there was one time when I retaliated, and said something sarcastic, immediately regretted it. But it was also interesting because sometimes when you do the wrong thing, it opens something up. And the wonderful thing about psychotherapy is, unless you really say something fatally damaging, you're able to talk about whatever it is you say or do. So in just going back to the question about whether literature can be redemptive for children in their adult lives, I hope so. And I say that, I think in the broader sense of literature, because not just reading, but of course writing and making of any kind. I think that we can be sentimental about creative expression, and just sort of think that it's sorry, my dog keeps wanting to. We can think that creative expression is just something kind of cozy and easy, relaxing, soothing to the soul. But actually, the thing about creative expression is that it can allow us to concentrate an intensity of feeling that might be unbearable in any other form. There are things that you might want to say, or just to yourself, if to no one else. And at that point, having a blank page or a blank canvas or a piece of clay or whatever in front of you, I think really is redemptive at that point. Not in the sentimental sense, but it redeems the feeling that's kind of been locked up for so long.
There's one more question. Josh, can you talk about the pandemic and how it has affected our idea of self?
Well, that's such a wonderful and big question. I think I want to talk, I suppose, as maybe many people do, about two movements in the pandemic. Because when the pandemic started and we all went online and we all went into lockdown and the circuit of our lives narrowed so intensely, there was initially, I think, within certainly the culture that I was inside, there was a kind of embrace. People, first of all, talked about the transformation of sensual life, that with traffic off the roads, you could hear birdsong, you could smell the smells of nature and culture around you, that so many of the distorting filters had been removed. And that kind of more immediate, visceral engagement with the external world, I think, had a parallel in an engagement with ourselves. That certainly there was a rash of inquiries for myself and for every psychotherapist I knew. Lockdown, yes, there were emergency situations. People felt that their mental health was deteriorating because of isolation or because of bad relationships. But it wasn't just that. There was a sense that, well, now I have time to do something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, but I always find ways to avoid it. And now I don't need to avoid it. And I can cultivate some curiosity about myself. So I think that in the first movement of the pandemic, what we experienced was more proximity with ourselves and a kind of a willingness to be more curious, which I think was transformative. I think as this over the months, and particularly in the second stage, I mean, most countries experienced a second period of lockdown, and that started to feel quite different, because instead of it being experienced as opening up new opportunities, new ways of relating, it felt like being confined to one specific form of existence. And I think when it started to feel like constraint rather than opening up, when people started to notice more what they were missing than what they were gaining, then a kind of, instead of experiencing a kind of comfort and interest in burrowing back into ourselves, people started to experience the self as a kind of prison and wanted to bust out of it. And so as soon as people were able to, regardless in a way of the risks a lot of the time, they sort of plunged into social interaction and sort of mass meeting. Many people didn't. Many people still were very wary and trepidatious and found the whole idea of sort of having face-to-face meetings with people very, very difficult. I found it very difficult to get back into anything like the ordinary circuit of social life. I still do find it very strange. So I think that the self during the pandemic has experienced the pull between a new interiority and a complete weariness with interiority, and a reminder that we're social beings. And I think that we've experienced the pull of our interiority and our sociality with real intensity. It's been, at both ends. Sorry, I'm aware that the glimpses of family life are being afforded to the good people of Miami. Whoever else is tuning in right now. But,
well, I think
that's involuntary disclosure. Yeah.
We're probably close to the end anyway.
And it's been great. This has been, what a fantastic conversation. I mean, I could listen for another hour easily. I feel like there's so much still to discuss. And I just, I want to ask you, are you taking new patients, either one of you? Because I want to share with you that last night I attended my 40th high school reunion. And talk about the different selves all coming together, and after not exactly post-pandemic, but wow, there was a lot going on there. So anyway, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for supporting independent bookstores like ours. Congratulations on this great book. Which people really, it's not too early for the holidays. So please go ahead. We have it at our stores. You can come in and buy it if you're in Miami, or you can just click on the green button at the bottom of the screen and we'll ship it out to you now, and it'll be there in time for the holidays, which is great. And if neither one, since I'm a bookseller and I can't help it, if neither one of you have read A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, I think you'd both love it. You'd both get a lot out of it. But anyway.
I agree. It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Oh, so you've read it. You've read it. Okay. Great. Of course. I should have expected that. Anyway, we look forward, Nuar, to having you back with us when your book comes out. Talking about animals, my dog has now entered the room as well, so I think it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.